Right.
And then when his father died, he comes back at the tender age of 26 to take over. And so he is dealing with an internal problem because he's got this first generation who's tough as nails and control the military. And he's got the second generation that's just batshit crazy. And so he's trying to figure out how he can winnow their ranks down without triggering a civil war. And his solution was to beat his chest a lot to satisfy them all. That got the attention of Donald Trump because Donald Trump assumed it was all about him. And that's where the whole fire and fury Twitter war came from. So he sees an opportunity.
My button is bigger than your button?
Exactly. So Kim Jong-un is like, tweets out, holy crap, I didn't mean for this to happen. This is not what I meant. My button's the perfect size. I'm not going to make it any bigger. And thank you very much. Have a nice day. That led to the summit, believe it or not, because Trump was non-traditional. And as soon as the Chinese found out that there was going to be a summit, they dragged Kim Jong-un to Beijing to yell at him. And when it became apparent they couldn't talk him out of it, because he was planning on using Trump as a way to balance power within North Korea, they put Kim Jong-un in a little kiddie chair, and they put Xi in his big booster chair behind his big imperial desk so he could lecture down to the wayward province. And the Chinese ate it up. They loved the propaganda. So Kim Jong-un goes back now convinced that the Chinese are all idiots and he absolutely has to have the summit with Trump. And so it does go forward. Best guess now is that between the tete-a-tete with Trump and between the cold relations with China, that Kim Jong-un really has succeeded in getting the first and second generations under control. And he has his own little one-man show, and he is secure. And if you'll notice, a lot of the threats have died down in the last couple of years. And my favorite little bit is earlier this year, while the Ukraine war is raging, they started acting up again. And Secretary of State Blinken said, fine. We'll come to North Korea. We'll talk about whatever you want, no preconditions. And the North Koreans have been deathly silent ever since because they caught the car and they just don't know what to do with it. 3/4 of global agricultural shipments, manufacturing supply chain steps, and energy shipments travel the ocean blue, and 2/3 of all of those shipments travel the ocean blue in East Asia. Without freedom of the seas, the global system as we understand it doesn't just die, it just has no possibility of existing. And you are talking then about not just mass famine, but the mass deindustrialization of large portions of the planet, with China being first in line. I like to think I'm a realist. We've been living in this wonderful period since 1945, where the Americans created globalization as a way of inducing allies to join the cause against the Soviets, and it worked. But never forget that for the United States, this was never an economic plan. It was a security play, and it worked. But that made everyone's economies dependent upon how the Americans view their own security. And after 1992, our view of our security has changed. We don't see the Cold War as this overwhelming threat anymore. Even with the Russians being back on the warpath in Ukraine, that hasn't changed American minds on globalization. If anything, it's reinforced it. Because if you look at all the deals that the Russians are if you look at all the deals that the Americans are cutting with the Japanese, the Europeans, and everyone else on the war, every single one of them is 100% purely security. None of them are guns for butter deals where there's some sort of Bretton Woods or globalization 2 on offer. In fact, every trade tariff, every trade war that Donald Trump initiated, the Biden administration has doubled and tripled down on, except for one out of over 80. We're done. And if we're done, we are honestly just kind of marking time until something in this system breaks. The Ukraine war very well could be that thing. Absolutely started the war, just in case there was any doubt there. You got to look at the Russian space. The territory that they live in from Central Europe out into Siberia is some of the world's worst farmland. You can grow one crop of short season wheat and that's about it. So the Russians have never been able to have a national road network. They've never had the money. Everything has to be moved by rail. And so their forces move very, very slowly. They have to literally walk places. And if you look at the area around where they live, there are a lot of open territories that are useless. They're near desert, they're near Arctic. And then beyond that are some actual barriers, places where there are deserts or seas or mountains. So the Russian strategy going back over 3 centuries has been to advance out of their kind of crappy land, through the really crappy land on their shoulders, and then get to those geographic barriers where you can't run a panzer division through it. And then they forward position those very, very slow-moving troops on the access points between those barriers. Unfortunately for Ukraine, they're not in those barriers, but they're on the way to two of them. So from the Russian point of view, what's going on in Ukraine is like phase 5 of an 8-part plan. The Russians have done this multiple times in other countries in the former Soviet world since 1992. And if they succeed in Ukraine, they will push on. And the next line of countries that would allow them to actually control those access points include Romania and Poland, both of which are NATO countries. I was counting. I think that was 18 questions. Let me do my best.
Answer them all.
All right, let's start with this straightforward bit. The Russians massively outnumber the Ukrainians, and they have a lot more men to lose, and they have a lot higher tolerance for casualties. So the 2 or 3 to 1 ratio that the Ukrainians have been inflicting on the Russians in terms of casualty ratios is wildly insufficient if the Ukrainians are going to win. They need to achieve a series of mass fatality events that kills at least minimum 500,000 Russian troops in a very short period of time. That is very difficult to do. They also, because of the numbers disconnect, can only win if they win on quality and, above all, mobility. And they haven't been able to do that this winter because it has been freakishly warm in Ukraine all winter. The ground never froze solid. It's still about 40 degrees today on the 1st of February in Kiev. And that means that all of the fields are not frozen solid, they're mud. And the Ukrainians can't maneuver in the mud, so they can't use their superior mobility in order to encircle, cut off, and dice up the Russian troops. This is buying the Russians time. What's the word I'm looking for here? Mobilization. And by the time we get to May 1, which will be spring and mud season will be over, the Ukrainians will have more troops with more training and better equipment, but the Russians will have thrown an extra 500,000 men into the fight. So we're going to find out very, very soon, certainly before the end of June, which of these battle strategies is going to be more effective. And the numbers absolutely favor the Russians. Because remember, unless the Ukrainians can inflict 8 to 1 casualty ratios, they still lose. But if they can pull that off and completely break Russian military power, then it's game on. We will know by mid-June just who's going to win this war. Now, step 2, the impact that this has on all those economic issues you were bringing up. The Russians are a major producer or processor of any number of industrial and agricultural materials that just don't have good substitutes anywhere. On the agricultural front, potash is the most important one. In terms of industry, I'd say chromium and nickel are probably near the top because you can't make steel without them. All of this stuff has been maintained, all this infrastructure has been maintained not by the Russians, but by Westerners who are no longer there.